Hello and welcome to the Gen Elders interview from Ecovillage Pathways. This was held at La Cité Écologique during the Ecovillage Pathways Youth and Elder Connection event. Part 1 of this interview series includes Rob Wheeler, a Gen United Nations representative, Marti Mueller, the co-founder of Awakening Spirit and so many other things, and Lois Arkin, an integral part of Los Angeles Ecovillage. It'll end with some face exercises for relaxation from Robert Gilman, and then everyone else that you hear introduce themselves will also be featured in part 2 of this interview. Hope you enjoy the show.
Thank you. So I'm calling in from Cascadia, which also is known as the Pacific Northwest and Washington State. I'm on a fairly big island, actually, north of Seattle. So that's where I'm calling in from.
Hi, I'm calling from intensely urban Los Angeles, about 3 miles west of downtown LA. We are among the most dense areas in the entire, we are actually denser than New York City in the area that I live in the Los Angeles Ecovillage. And we identify our 2 blocks as a demonstration urban ecovillage. And I'll pass it along to Lee.
Okay, thanks, Lois. Yeah, I'm calling from the headwaters of the Beaver River and the Lake Simcoe watershed in Uxbridge, Ontario, Canada. And beautiful day, and it's great to be on this call. And I'll pass it to Rob.
Thanks, Lee. I'm in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in the United States, and I'm actually sitting outside the library because my internet is down at home. So in about 45 minutes, people are going to leave the library, and I'll try to monitor the sound. Thanks.
Here we are. And I'm calling in from the San Luis Valley in the Rocky Mountains of southern Colorado. And we are 1.5 miles above sea level. And hopefully we're going to get rain because we've been having a terrible drought, but it's cloudy right now. So everyone pray with me while we're on this call.
All right, this is Sarah, who lives at La Cité.
So I'm living in Coburg, New Hampshire. That's the small part of the La Cité Écologique. The main one is in Quebec, and that's where I moved a long time ago, 34 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I'm in US since 20 years. That's also.
And Alizé?
Okay. I'm from Quebec, from the mother house of the Cité Écologique. So we were 4 people when that started. And I can remember everything from then until now. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you and sharing that experience. And I hope you share yours with us.
Excellent. And so for the sake, I know it sounded like the closest to a time restriction was Rob Wheeler with the library exodus pending. So I would love if you could introduce a little more about your background, and then we'll open the floor for about 5 minutes to kind of give some reflection on those questions that you already shared some brilliant answers with me about, and then we'll have another 5 minutes to open the floor for questions from everyone here and have that dialogue. So I'm passing you the mic.
Okay, so I first found out about Ecovillage communities back in the 1970s when I was a college student, and was following what was happening with the farm in Tennessee. Peter Caddy from Findhorn came out and talked about what they were doing with the gardens and the messages from the Deva nature spirits. And Oroville was really getting started, and we were hearing about what was happening with that community. And it was fascinating to me. And I was reading In Context magazine that Robert was putting out. And we were doing back to the land type of activities with friends from college communities. And it was like an exciting time to be a hippie and to be alive in California going to college. So I loved everything I was reading about and hearing about. And back then, the eco-villages were considered counterculture, hippie communes. And to some extent, I would suppose we still are today, but we are the forefront of where humanity has to go and is going and transitioning to a sustainable future. So while we were seen as counterculture and hippie, it was sooner or later had to become mainstream, and we're getting closer to that all the time. So that's good news. In the late 1900s, I was involved with an institute in India and met Ross and Hilda Jackson through my good friend Marti Mueller. And there was an earthquake that happened in 2001, and it devastated a whole northern region of India and wiped out a lot of the villages and hospitals and schools. And Rajmi had developed a plan for eco-village development that I was supporting him with at the United Nations. And so I got involved with Jen. We took that initiative and turned it into a UN partnership initiative and launched it through Jen Senegal with Miriam Seitlin, who is also one of Jen's elders, and supported the development of their work there in Senegal. And I've continued to represent Jen at the United Nations since then. So I've gone every year to the Commission on Sustainable Development, and now it's the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And for the last several years, we've had delegations that have gone to the climate summit conferences, and I've been a part of that delegation and planning team again. And I'm pretty sure we will again do this, going to Poland this year. And for the high-level political forum, it takes place in New York City. And we have an exhibit that we are putting on with a number of other organizations there in New York, focusing on eco-village, regenerative eco-village development for resilient communities, natural and cultural heritage, and ecosystem restoration programs and work. And so we would love it if any youth are interested in coming to New York and helping us with the exhibit. We also have activities happening through social media through an intern that's involved both with Jen and with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Marina Kamsova. And she will be putting together a package of social media activities. So if you want to help out, that would be wonderful as well. There's a very active youth caucus that comes every year in the world to participate in the sustainable development processes at the New York. If were to come out, they could participate in all the different activities that are going on with the governments and with civil society, as well as be a part of the youth caucus, and I would support them in getting involved. So that's kind of an overview. I work in Jen's fundraising working group, and we have a UN advocacy working group that I'm one of the coordinators of. And we have program development that we're doing around the world that our advocacy group is associated with. So if anyone is interested in seeing how they could support Ecovillage development program activities through Jen, I can also help facilitate that. And I'm a part of Jen's Elders Council as well.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary mouthful of international work that you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing. I'll open the floor here. Is there any questions folks have for Rob about his various work that he's doing, getting involved, how he got to where he is now?
Yeah, I'm just curious about what the story was that you got from the Findhorn people.
Yeah, there's some very good books. When the community was established, they had been running a five-star hotel in northern Scotland, and transitioned to live with their family in a little trailer. And the two women that were involved were doing channelings every night that came from God and from nature spirits. And they were given guidance to start a garden. And they lived in a little trailer in an abandoned Air Force base. And they followed the guidance from spirit. And they had the most plentiful garden probably in all of Scotland. It was really incredible. One day they would be told that Peter had plans to do such and such, and instead he told to go to another community, take his pickup truck, and halfway there he found a big pile of horse manure, so he scooped it all up and took it back and put it in his garden. He said, oh, now I know why I was supposed to go there. And another day they had problems with the gophers, and they didn't know what to do about the gophers, so they went into a meditation and talked with the nature spirits, and they were told to direct the gophers to go to a new place to live near the community. And they did, and all of a sudden they heard all this noise, and they looked out the window, and there's this herd of gophers coming out of the ground and going across the field all together to a new location and leaving the garden area. So I had the good fortune during Gen Plus 20 to stay in one of the original cottages as that community started to develop into an eco-village. Now it's one of the foremost eco-village learning centers in the world, and it's continued to develop over the last 50 years. I think there's something like 500 people living there now, and it's a quite wonderful community. And there's also where Jen has its headquarters.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was a brilliant story. I guess I have a personal question, also coming from California, and also coming from the eccentric scene of California. How you transitioned from this being kind of a community of people you love, living a revolution, and kind of doing it for yourselves within your own, within arm's reach, people that you kind of loved and collaborated with, and now transitioning to this more kind of representative for communities, which is such an kind of an ambitious, large title, and so it kind of going from friends and family to all of a sudden traveling and having it be a movement and a defined thing, and how your relationship with community shifted.
Yeah, it was a big step. I loved living in California, and I lived in Santa Cruz and I lived in Arcata, both very progressive college communities where there was so much going on. I spent 5 years organizing a sustainable community campaign just before I left. But in the 90s, I had followed the Earth Summit conference that took place in Rio de Janeiro. I was checking into what the United Nations was doing, and I was seeing how ineffective it was compared to the challenges we face. And I said, well, there's got to be a way to create a more effective United Nations. And I actually left everything behind in order to lobby for a People's House at the United Nations, hoping that we could have a much stronger impact trying to get our governments to do what we all needed to happen. In the 70s, we knew that these changes had to take place, but how we couldn't get the institutions to shift at the speed they needed to shift. We knew then we had to transition to sustainable energy, and we knew that if they would put enough funding into it, the price would drop so dramatically that we would automatically make the transition. But to get them to make that kind of an investment, the institution and the government, was extremely challenging and difficult. But that's what we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years. Finally, enough monies have been invested into it that the price has dropped dramatically. And now it makes more sense financially to invest in renewables. And the same thing is across the board, every area of sustainable development. And it's why I continue to support Ecovillage development, because we are pioneering so many of the techniques and the practices and the technologies that need to be brought into mainstream culture. And they can learn a lot from us, the rest of mainstream.
Yeah, that is for sure. They have a lot to learn. I'm wondering, particularly, I know for millennials, there is often a sensation right now that the problems of the world are overwhelming in a way, with climate change taking over and massive corrupt governments. And I would wonder about how you persevered, staying confident with hope over the past decades, and not kind of running back to your community where it was working.
Yeah, well, going to the UN meetings can be very frustrating at times, but there's also things that are very rewarding, and we see progress being made, even though I'd like to see it much faster, and it gets extremely frustrating to say things that aren't all that well listened to by governments. We know we have the Sustainable Development Goals now, and I was at the first meeting when that took place, and my contribution was to say, if we're serious about achieving ambitious goals and about making a transition to full sustainability, then there are prerequisites that we have to meet. That's transitioning to 100% renewables, eliminating waste, phasing out toxic chemicals as fast as we could, and I named a couple of other things like that. But the governments never just accepted that, that it took 3 years for them to negotiate to move in that direction. So we have SDGs that are maybe halfway to where we have to go, but I was hoping the governments would say, okay, we recognize we need to transition to full sustainability. This is what it'll take. This is the goal that we're all going to put in place programs and activities in order to achieve that. The UN moves in little steps incrementally at a time. So you just have to be patient and trust that you're getting somewhere, even though it's much slower and more frustrating than you'd like to see. But the Sustainable Development Goals were a great achievement that we didn't expect to come out of Rio Plus 20 when we went into it. But I don't think any of the governments are anywhere as close to putting in place the programs and activities that are really needed to achieve the SDGs, even though they're not near as ambitious as what we need. If you do come to New York, you have access to government representatives that you can't get anywhere else in the world. So I can walk up, if I have an environmental minister from any country that I want to meet with, and they are at the conference, I can walk up to them and arrange a meeting with them. I can't do that in Washington, D.C. I could spend weeks trying to make a meeting with someone like that.
Lois, I think, so Rob, please stay on. We'll definitely come back to you with more general questions once we open the floor. Thank you for all thank you. Thank you so much, Rob, for all that you're doing. This is a round of applause. Yes, we're just learning in our elder circle about the importance of gratitude for carrying the torch on into the next generation, appreciating all the work y'all have already done. So thank you.
And I wanted to comment on Rob's contribution because he has done so much work, really up to date on what's been happening in New York in the United Nations, and he's done a lot of it without having any payment for it. It's come out of a deep place in his heart, and we're all very grateful to him.
Marti, you already have your mic open, so if you would like to introduce yourself about the work that you've done, and then the projects you're working on now, and then some of your reflections on what it is to be an elder and work with youth in the modern eco-village movement.
Marti, in the Gen since the beginning, or since the Findhorn 1996 conference. And the way it developed, we had a board of of 4 people who went out into the world to actually identify different, both sustainable communities and traditional eco-villages, communities that we thought could be part of our network. And at the same time, as there were 4 males from the north, and that was not, these were the folks that were available at that time. Hildur Jackson, who is one of our founders, our true founders, and who has a great love for the South, formed the Wisdom Keepers, and there were 4 of us. Hilda herself was the chairperson, and Rashmi Mayur, an Indian who had done a lot of the similar work to what Rob is doing now, but from India. Helena Norbert Hodges, whom probably most of you know for her amazing work in Ladakh, and then myself. And our focus was more on bringing the feminine aspects into the Gen and also focusing on the South. And then after a certain period of time, we established an International Advisory Council, and I was the chair of that for about a decade, which meant I went to a lot of board meetings. We had a board meeting every year, and I got to see many beautiful communities throughout the world. So it was a great honor to be in that position. And then what happened, I went to, when the Finhorn meeting happened, it was a Gen plus 10. I looked around at the speakers list and everybody was over 40, 45, sometimes 50. And I thought, this doesn't feel right. So with one of the young people there, we formed a group and I helped to facilitate them through the first steps of creating the next Gen. And that was a beautiful experience. And I've received so many thank yous from people who had been at that meeting, because they had said that the possibility of being empowered had really inspired them. And of course, what the Gen represents, because it is one of the, I would say, few organizations in the world that's actually oriented towards exactly what this planet needs. And I also wanted to say that, by the way, for me, elder does not mean somebody who's elderly. What it means is someone who's got wisdom and some perspective on life. And I just came from a conference in Britain, in Somerset last weekend. There were about 20 people. After a long list, they selected down to 20. I think I was the only person over 30. And everybody in that room was an elder of some sort or another. That young people today are as much sometimes elders as people who are age-oriented elders. And we shouldn't forget that. And we need to work very closely together, because youth have got, the youth of today have an amazing capacity to understand technology, to see the global picture, to be completely connected. And I think this is really important, because we're in an age of urgency where the shifts in thinking have to happen on a really rapid scale. And what we're going to see with climate change is a real acceleration of the process. We're seeing it now in terms of all the sort of very radical weather conditions, but we're just going into the vortex now. And I don't have a lot of, I'm not one of these people who, I don't believe in that the United Nations is going to make a great difference. I think it's important that the Gen is part of it, but I don't think nations are going to do it, and nor organizations like the UN or UNESCO. Or UNITAR, or any of the others. I think it has to happen through citizens' action groups and communities. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to slow down the process. I don't think we're going to manage to reduce significantly our carbon dioxide, the temperatures, that are starting to really become alarming to everyone. And while I'm not a pessimist, I think it's important that we go ahead with incredible optimism. I think the most important thing we can teach young people today in our schools and high schools and universities is to go for courage and integrity, because that's what we're really going to need, because what's coming down is going to be very, very difficult. And I think the fact that we now have the kind of communications that allow us to have a collective consciousness, I think this is going to be important as well, because I think we're going for a transformation of consciousness and a transmutation of the physical body. Because if we go up another 4 degrees centigrade in mean temperature on this earth, we don't have lungs to breathe the nitrogen and sulfur that's going to be released from the melting of the tundras in Russia, and also in Greenland and Antarctica. I was in Greenland just a couple of months ago. We happened to have been lucky to have had a very cold winter up there. But I've been reading the reports on Antarctica, and it's extremely alarming. And what is going to get us is not rising oceans, but atmospheric shifts. We do not have the lungs to breathe what's coming down. So how do we remain optimistic? Well, I don't think there are any miracles, but I think somehow if we have a love for the earth and a love for earth species and for each other, we just have to continue to act with great integrity. One of the things I think we really need to face is population explosion, because the exponentials from population are going to kill us as well. And it's a very delicate subject, because we can talk all we want about SDGs and about poverty alleviation, leave no one behind, but if we don't actually address population, we'll never make it. And what it means is it's really acknowledging the fact that 20% of the population uses 80% of the resources, and 80% of the population have only access to 20%, but they also represent a tyranny in numbers. So the tyranny in numbers for the developed world is high consumption, and the tyranny in numbers for the developing world is huge expanding populations. So we need to deal with it in a way that makes sense, that is not damaging to people, that acknowledges the fact we love children and we want to bring children into the world, but we need to actually start to balance the numbers. And that was something Indigenous people were really good at. They did not expand their populations beyond the Earth's carrying capacity. So anyway, now you've heard a little bit of what I'm concerned about. I'm working quite a lot with Indigenous at the moment, both in Southeast Asia, also a little bit in India. We're all Indigenous, by the way. And I've been up in Greenland working with the Inuit culture on safeguarding their traditions and helping them to understand the planetary implications of climate change. They know on a very local level exactly what it means when they can't fish and hunt because the ice pack isn't hard enough. But they're still not understanding to any great extent what it means in terms of the carbon dioxide flows in the ocean, the effect that this is going to have on them, and also the possibility that Europe is going to experience a mini ice age. So one of the things I've been doing up there with them is trying to explain what happens at the polar regions when we have increases in temperature at the equator. I'll stop talking soon because you may have questions, but at the equator, if there's a 4%, a 4-degree increase in temperature, it means in the Arctic, it'll be 15 degrees, and in Antarctica, 8 degrees. So they're starting to really feel the effects of that, and they haven't been able to understand exactly why that's happening. So having a little science helps them at least to understand that, and then we have to work out what we're going to do as a community together. Yeah, I'll be going up to Standing Rock on Sunday. We're doing a solstice celebration, and it's going to be rather small. I think we'll have between 300 and 1,000 people. And one of the important reasons we're doing it is that I guess everybody knows about Standing Rock here. Yeah, you all know? Okay. Is that, as we were fighting the DAPL pipeline that was coming over reservation land and was threatening to pollute 11 states along the Mississippi, the Missouri River and the Mississippi, hundreds of thousands of people actually visited Standing Rock, and there were over 320 flags that flew from Indigenous groups all over the world, and it was very inspiring. But we lost the battle, and the pipeline is going under the Missouri, and if there's a big spill, people are going to really feel it. But the impact of what happened and the aftermath was such that the people who live there now are back to ground zero, and there's a lot of alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic abuse, a lot of difficult problems that exist there. And so we're going up there for a celebration to help them work out how they can form communities, eco-villages of sorts. There'll be some permaculture workshops and some other, and some gardening and some work on climate change and on safeguarding the traditions. And we're just going to see what we can build there. And any of you who are free and want to come and join us, you're welcome.
Thank you. On so many levels. And now we're going to open the floor to some questions of everyone here. Here you go. Oh, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Jay. My question is, I have a two-part question. I loved what you said, and I'm so inspired by the work that you're doing. My first question is, I totally agree with what you're saying about local action and citizenship. So my question is, what is a best way to instill responsibility in local people to act is the first part of the question. The second is, where do we start? There's a lot that we have to tackle, but once the community comes together, what is the first point of action that we can start working on, according to you?
First of all, people need to understand that we have to stop relying on others for the changes we need to make ourselves. And that has to be made very clear, because people expect a miracle, or they expect governments to pick it up, or institutions. We can only do it ourselves, whatever that means, which is local, but also then connecting to networks. I would, if I were working on this subject, I would meet with people, plan something really fun, like picnics and this kind of thing, to really get to know each other. And then start looking at where water's coming from, where food is coming from, whether it's possible to do a community garden, what type of housing exists. And in that is that opportunity too, to look at whether you're working in a region where there are a lot of refugees coming in and homeless, and how the community can expand out to include everyone. Then I think with the GEN, what's really interesting is the Gaia Education Program, which is these Ecovillage design education programs that allow people to study economics, social worldview, and environment, and get a kind of feel for direction. Then having a community looking at what's meaningful livelihood, and maybe just witnessing what people have to say about how their lives are working or not working, and how that can change. I'd like to hear from other people as well, so I don't want to monopolize the time.
Thank you so much for sharing, and for doing the work that you do. Please continue. And would anyone else on the call like to continue to answer that question?
I can pipe in here a little bit. When we consider, hi everyone, and Marty, so nice to hear from you. When I consider the sources of global greenhouse gases, three major sources, and I do this all the time in our tours, one of the first things I'm saying today versus what I said 20, 25 years ago, and there's a big sign on my wall here. It says, incrementalism is passé, stop climate change today. And think about the three major sources of greenhouse gas, and certainly here in LA, between vehicles and buildings and animal farming, our big issue is vehicles. And so I often encourage people to look at their lives in those three different areas and what they produce that's bad for the planet in those three areas, and try to do something in each of those areas that's radical for their particular living pattern. So I'll leave it to someone else now. Anyone else have advice about that?
I might just throw in something. It might sound a bit strange, but I think that all the gatherings that are happening in the world around music, around art, what's happening at Burning Man, I don't know if any of you are burners out there, but there's an opportunity to actually connect with people all over the world who are asking the same questions, and then come up with some people have worked very well in specific areas. For instance, solar energy. Burning Man has projects in Burners Without Borders, where they're going into areas where There's a need for eco-housing and urgency packets when there's an earthquake or a hurricane or a tsunami. And at the same time, so I think it's good if you have an opportunity to go to a festival or to go to events that connect culture and art, but underneath it all is this possibility of connecting together with people who are like-minded. Because it gives us the feeling we're not alone, for one thing. And secondly, then you invite some of these people into your communities, and they can help you build something, and you can help them to increase the impact, the eco impact throughout the world. And I think art and culture are really important in all this, because it can be very inspiring. And I just spent last week with some folks from Mexico who are working near the border, and they have all these problems with the drug cartels, and they use graffiti in incredible ways to pass messages, where otherwise, if people were to know who was passing the message, they'd end up disappearing. And so to be able to use art and in culture, and most of us are privileged to live in parts of the world where we actually can express free speech, and to use that as a way of really inspiring people is important as well. Do any of you go to Burning Man or Glastonbury or any of the festivals out there? No?
Yeah, I definitely burn. Being from Oakland, it's kind of a requirement.
Okay. Can you comment?
Otherwise, the whole town evacuates, and so if you want to see any friends, you have to go to Burn. Does anyone else have any questions for Marti? One more question I had for you was your work with indigenous cultures.
Yeah.
There's such a long lineage of elder and youth, and the transition not to broadcast on all indigenous cultures, but the more distinct transition of coming from being a youth to being an elder in those cultures. And so it sounds like you've worked with a diverse array of them, and I was wondering if you could reflect at all on their relationship with elders and youth.
Well, it varies an immense amount, as you can well imagine, but most indigenous cultures have rites of passage, which means there's a certain point between going from childhood to adolescence where there's a marked taking on of responsibility. It could be in terms of, like, in Greenland, it usually involves around when you shoot your first, I'm a vegetarian, but anyway, when you shoot your first bird, or you catch your first seal, and then you're initiated into the culture in a different way. And then what normally happens in indigenous cultures, because they're still so close to nature, is that the elders and the youth are going out together to hunt, to fish, to work the land, if that is the case. And so the division isn't quite as strong as it is in more advanced cultures where we separate people by generations. Okay, so in indigenous, there's a lot more of a sort of flow between the ages, which you also find in many of our intentional and traditional eco-villages, but you find very little of actually in cities. What else can I say? I think very often what happens in indigenous cultures is that the future leaders are chosen when people are children. Actually, I can remember sitting in council with Leon Shenandoah, who was the Grand Chief of the Iroquois Nation, and there are over 600,000 Iroquois. And he was chosen at 6 years old to be the Grand Chief by the grandmothers. It's usually the women who choose. And he just had those capacities, and the capacities have to do with integrity and courage. It's not necessarily who's the smartest, or who catches on the most quickly, but who can embody this sort of values that everyone can respect. Indigenous people are usually very all-inclusive. They will sit in a circle, not in a set of rows of seats like people in Western and in advanced what we call advanced cultures do. They sit in a circle, and everyone is equidistant in that circle, which means everyone is equal. And I've sat in political meetings in Tamil Nadu, where Oroville is located and where I spend part of the year, and they'll go around the room and every person will speak, even if it's a 5-year-old child. And so there's a feeling of equality, and I think that's really important because we've built societies based on hierarchy, and which makes people feel, in many respects, quite insecure in their sense of being. It's not an empowerment, a hierarchy. So yeah, there's so much we can learn from the indigenous. The Kogi in Colombia are an amazing people, and they're very deeply spiritual. And I just wanted to mention something that John Croft talked to us about at one time, and which made a great impression on me. He talked about how when they study societies that have gone through Holocausts, and certainly as we face climate change, we're facing something that's going to be very deeply challenging. He said those who survive are people who have a strong, first, collective spirit, because human beings can't make it on their own. They need to work together in terms of a collective goal. People who have a strong vision, a spiritual practice of some sort, and that could be as broad as worldview is, and people who can adapt very readily, very, very quickly. And what I really admire about youth today is that many young people are much more interested in experience than collecting objects or owning homes or any of the rest. And today's young people are very much into traveling around the world, seeing what's happening. And there's a saying by Lao Tzu. He said, those who wander may not necessarily be lost. I'm paraphrasing it kind of badly. What does he say?
Not all who wander are lost.
Sorry?
Not all who wander are lost.
Not all who wander are lost. And I think that's very, very good way to actually describe what's happening amongst the youth generation today. This kind of hunger to go out, to know what's happening in the world, to experience, rather than to so-called settle down, buy a house, live in a suburb, earn a lot of money. And so this is important because we're going into a stage now where we need to have that kind of high level of flexibility and understand that there's real value in relations rather than in objects. And in the Lakota tradition, when two children fight over the same toy, they take the kids outside and set them up on a hill and ask them to look at the sky. And when the kids start looking at the sky, they suddenly realize how small they are and how immense the earth is, and how incredibly fortunate we are that nature has given us so much. And it reduces their sense of selfishness and their sense of having to compete against each other and all the rest. So I think that the indigenous wisdoms can be really of great value to us now.
Thank you so much for sharing. A round of applause here. And I want to say, yeah, personally for me also, the number of different types of communities you drew wisdom from in your description, from the Burning Man community to the indigenous cultures to the women of South America. Like I really appreciate your ability to find the wisdom all around the world and then bring it to us. So thank you.
And I think we all share wisdom. People like, I have great admiration for Lois and what she's done on an urban level, and that's very challenging as well. And for Rob and for all of you, I think it's great.
It's good to be part of the community. We're all working together. And that's a beautiful transition. Lois, I would love to hear about your projects in Los Angeles in the past, and then the new ones you sent me you're working on now. Sounds like a lot of exciting stuff. So,
well, the first thing I'd like to do is just feel, how honored I feel to be here amongst you. And particularly the reason that I'm here with you all today is because of Robert. And back in the early 1990s, late 1990s, with the first study that Robert and his late wife Diane did on for Gaia Trust. Before we were ever on the ground, we were only envisioning a new eco-village, and somehow I got wind of it and wrote to Robert, and he invited me to write an article for in context on our vision for this new multi-million-dollar brand new project we dreamed of creating. And from there, then I guess that article was included in the study that Ross and Hilder contracted for with Robert and Diane to do the Ecovillage, the wonderful spiral book that I still have and really is still so relevant with many of the eco-villages, that some of which were on the ground and some of which were mere visions back in the 1980s. And so thank you again, Robert, for putting us on the map. And then then it was a year or two later in Los Angeles that we had the 1992 uprisings. And although we were planning this wonderful new ground up eco-village on an 11-acre vacant site here in the city, just a few miles from downtown, on an old landfill that was, you know, kind of construction waste, all of a sudden it was 1992 in LA, and we had the civil unrest here, huge rioting and fires all over the city, 5 fires in the neighborhood that I lived in at the time. And it was, many of you of course read about that. And then it was like, oh, we had a 6-month discussion about what should our priorities be in LA. Should we be, you know, developing this fancy, sexy, new $25 million project that's going to take 25 years to make happen, and it isn't even near transit? Or should we be reconsidering what we should be doing in the city to kind of make some small progress toward this sort of thing, this kind of race rioting not happening anymore? And so after 6 months, we decided, oh, let's just do it in Lois's neighborhood. Our 20-member planning committee decided. And in December of 1992 and in January 1993, we began on the ground, owning nothing, having no intentional neighbors here, just having volunteers come in a few times a week and walk the neighborhood and start to, because it was a scary neighborhood and there a lot of gang activity, a lot of people were frightened of one another, a lot of tagging and graffiti, negative, bad graffiti kind of stuff. And so we just began that way. And it was, so that was 93. And then in 1995, we had the first international Eco-Village conference at Findhorn. And all of a sudden, one of our buildings, we knew we had to buy property, one of our buildings was for sale in the 2-block neighborhood. And I thought, oh my gosh, we better go and find out if Ross will loan us some money. And so we did. I did go to Findhorn in 1995, and that's where I met Linda. And Robert was there, of course, and Albert was there, and Marty, you were there. And that was when the Global Ecovillage Network started, and I was very honored to be there amongst you all. And then the rest is history. We bought the building. Ross loaned us $50,000. We paid it back, I'm happy to say, with interest. And then that was the first building that we acquired. And then today we own 3 multifamily buildings, 50 units of permanently affordable housing, with a community land trust owning the land and a limited equity co-op owning the housing. We have a contract with the local school district for a 1/4-acre learning garden in the center of the 2-block neighborhood. And then just a little over a year ago, we bought a 1/4-acre old auto shop and cafe on our northern boundary And all of these acquisitions in the heart of one of the most real estate speculating cities in the whole world, and the most expensive city, along with San Francisco and New York and Washington and probably Paris and Hong Kong, among the most expensive cities in the world to live in. We've acquired all of these properties with not 1 cent of bank funds. So it's all been through our ecological revolving loan fund, through borrowing money from our friends and relatives and neighbors, and making it happen, and paying interest on those loans and getting most of that money paid back. And most people, that when their term of their loan is up and we say, okay, we're ready to pay back on the interest, they say, oh no, keep it another year. Let me know next year. And because the idea of putting your money where you can come visit it and see what's happening, and come and have a community dinner with the people, and instead of having it go into some hedge funds or stocks and bonds, and who knows where it's going, who knows what it's doing, who knows who it's hurting. And so that's one of the great things about, I think, what we've done and what we get a lot of credit for. But most importantly, being here in the inner city of Los Angeles, and with all of the layers of bureaucracy, both within the city, within the county, at the state and the Fed, dealing with cities. And in our case now, with our newest property, it's a brownfield, which means that it's quite contaminated, having been an auto shop for nearly 100 years. Well, a gas station initially back in the 1920s, and then an auto shop. So it's quite a brownfield, and we're involved, and we have this strong desire to remediate it without the concept of a way, that there is no more a way, that we have, whether we're responsible for having created the contaminants or not, we have to learn how to render them harmless where we're at. And so we're doing a lot with, right now, with mushroom remediation, and we've recently connected with for some time now, with the city's brownfield department, and are working with one of their staff people who's also a PhD candidate at UCLA in areas of phytoremediation. And so she's going to help us get some grants to do some of the cleanup work on this quarter-acre property. But our vision for that property is to essentially make it several small green co-op oriented businesses in the shop, and also make the cafe a vegan cafe, and to have an eco-cooperative hostel where groups could come from all over the world, intentional communities, eco-villages, academic groups, civic organizations within the LA area, and have an immersion experience in urban sustainable living. Now, many of our rural eco-villages are already doing this all over the world, and it is amazing and wonderful. I'm not sure if there are, and if any of you know of any urban eco-villages that are doing the same thing. I know we all sponsor workshops and forums and that sort of thing, but in terms of like a weekend or a week-long or a 2-week-long immersion program for people in groups, where if they're coming from one of the 97 neighborhood councils in Los Angeles, then they have a group of people come for an immersion program, go back and teach those things that they learn here in their local neighborhoods. And that is kind of the vision for that, for the hostel, is to have people come in groups. So that said, let me just share a couple of my feelings about elders and wisdom and that sort of thing. I am an old lady. I just turned 81 this year, and I think that's why we bought this property. Maybe it'll keep me alive another decade or so. And I do think that with age and experience comes a certain amount of wisdom, if you're willing to acknowledge and use it and see it in yourself. And of course, we all know many older people that haven't done that, and but many have, and sometimes we don't always recognize it. I find that one of the wonderful things about living and working in an intergenerational intentional community of about 40 people, from infants to people in their 70s, and a lot in between, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, is that, especially for the younger people, I can depend on them for memory support. Yes, you're my memory support. When did that happen? When did we do that? What was the name of that guy who blah, blah, blah? And that's something that all of you older people recognize, and why we are so happy to be around younger people who love us and understand us, and know where they're going someday. And in terms of memory support, not every old person has these memory lapses, but most of us have some of it, and even younger, that we do too. I like to say also, living in the city and being so layered with bureaucracy for so many things that you want to do, that we now call a lot of the things that we have done and are doing pre-legal. And because some things that we were doing 20 years ago, like gray water systems and mulching mulching all of our grass and that sort of thing, were questionable by the city, and painting the intersection of our two streets and so forth. But what I like to say to people, and particularly young people, because we get so many groups, college groups, high school groups, and elementary school groups on our tours, and we love it, and we always have such a wonderful time with them. But we tell them, at the youngest to the postgraduate stage, look, anything you want to do to change the world, that maybe there's no regulation or public policy or law to support it, and maybe maybe it's actually against the law. If you know in your head that you're right, and you know in your heart that you're good, you got to stick your neck out and just do it. Yeah, you have to evaluate what the trade-offs are, but if they're, not too serious, like you're not going to end up in prison for 50 years, I always suggest you got to just go ahead and do it. But also, you have to be making friends. A lot of young people I'm finding today are kind of like, when it comes to, not always and not everywhere, but and especially in terms of the things that Marty said, you have got to make those political connections when you're young, and when you don't need them. So you got to go to those activities, you got to go to their public town hall talks and ask good questions, and learn who their field deputies are, and just make friends with people, sometimes in very low, maybe it's lots of times it's the young people who are in college or in grad school, and then they go to work for some public bureaucracy, and you remain friends for the next 20 or 30 years, which happened to me. We had interns back in the 1980s and 90s that are now in high places in local government. So it's easy to make a phone call about, hey, what do we do about so-and-so, and have friends in high places. Kind of like what Rob was saying about running into people at the UN, and you get to meet people and to talk to that you'd never get to do in Washington, D.C. Well, we all gotta make friends with those people wherever we can, and especially when we don't need them. So that's one thing that I have to say about that. And maybe I can stop here for a while and see if there are some questions.
Thank you so much. I want to start with just massive gratitudes for what you do, especially being in LA, which is ambitious to want to start a village in LA. Well, so many of us are kind of in the beauty of the woods, away from the intense urban issues, and you've stuck it out now for a quarter century. So thank you for being in the trenches. Opening the floor here to questions. Anyone have any questions? Yes, here comes Jess, passing the mic on.
Hi there. So I've lost my voice a little bit, so I'll try to speak. You had mentioned about no bake funding and the ecological funding. Is there an organization? So we see the Time's Up movement and how that is kind of a fund to help support legal action for anyone regarding equal rights. Is there a fund or an organization that's started to help, just be that central funding for these types of projects, or is it kind of just within your immediate network?
No, there is in the U.S. there's a national organization of community loan funds. I think it's Opportunity Knox, or just do a internet search. We used to belong to it when the annual dues were about $75 a year, but now I think they're a lot higher, and kind of we didn't feel like we really needed them right away. So, there are dozens of community revolving loan funds throughout the country that do this kind of work and make loans to local community development projects, and particularly affordable housing and economic development projects. And there, of course, there are thousands and thousands of community economic development organizations across the country now, and have been for years. And I think that these are challenges that we in the Ecovillage and Sustainable Communities movement, the Transition Town movement, if you will, have tremendous opportunities to connect with them and share with them. Like we get a lot of tours these days from other groups of people who are the staff people for other community development organizations in LA. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but just do a Google search for community loan funds. Community loan funds. It'll come right up. If you have any problem, it's really easy to find me, and I'll be able to direct you to some.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. And during our weekend here, we have so much resources and wisdom and nuggets and URLs to follow. We'll definitely work with you to help us add resources to the email that we send out, so everyone can kind of act on all the wisdom and opportunities that are being shared. I want to do a quick time check with everybody. So we have about 1 hour and 15 minutes left, and we have about 6 more folks, elders. And I so appreciate the stories at the background of how we got here, partially so we can just pour gratitude on the work that has been done and learn from where you've been. And so then also for the next folks to go to really think about in particular, the youth elder connection and what an elder means to you, and how youth can step up in a unique way, or any tensions you have around working with youth, and success stories around where you've seen the youth elder dynamic for its own unique offerings and gifts that dynamic has, where you've really seen it flourish, and how to create a nourishing container for that. So that being said, I'm going to open the floor. I'll pass it on to whoever's being called to speak next on the Skype call.
I've spoken a lot, so I don't want to say too much, but I do want to say there are a lot of organizations out there, not only in terms of loans for community building, but also in terms of equal rights. Daniel Sheenan has been working a lot with the indigenous, especially with the Lakota at the moment, because there were a lot of people who found themselves in prison after Standing Rock. I was at an economic conference, as I told you, in London last week, and from Oxford, there's a project called Whose Knowledge, WHOSE, and then knowledge, I think it's .com, and this is an organization that mostly it's youth who are actually running this organization, and it's oriented towards making the possibility for women and indigenous to have a stronger presence in Wikipedia and online, because still the profiles online it's about 80% masculine oriented. Alberto Roots from Mexico, who's also on our elders group, has been working with the United Nations on something called the rights of nature. And because nature can't speak for it's for herself, we need to speak for her. And they're planning to try to bring some major corporations up for trial, Monsanto and company, and some of the mining companies that are badly devastating the earth. And there's so many organizations out there that are helpful to all of us. And many of them are actually, the groundwork is being done by youth. And so, yeah, I think it would be really useful to have a list of some of these resources that we could all use.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely reach out to have everyone put that together. Is it? I think okay, I think we're gonna do a little bit of a boogie woogie dance here. It's in the afternoon here in the East, so we're gonna have a little dance break, and I encourage everyone on the call to also have a dance break. In a couple minutes, we'll get back into the flow. So may the dance begin.
Yay! All right, everyone.
Woo.
Wow. I got lost for a while. Did anyone else?
We're having a dance party.
Oh.
Just for 1 minute. All right.
That's it?
I have an idea. I was thinking that maybe if Robert wanted to go next and do a little facial exercise, and then have that lead in, because that's been a cool practice.
And Robert, before you go, could I say just one last thing? If you can hear me, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. For all the youth that are tuning in here, I am trying to do some serious succession planning. So if there's any folks out there, young folks really passionate about urban eco-villages, do be in touch. That's all I have to say for now. Okay.
That is brave work. So thank you so much for actively passing on the torch, and I'm many blessings on that search. The right person is out there.
I just make a comment about transition. I think transition is really difficult. Time came to pass power. I wasn't really sure there was anybody who could be competent enough to do it. And I resisted it in a way because we'd had so many political imbroglios with the Indian government. And what happened is I got pushed to do it because some of the young people in the community really, really wanted to participate. And I had always arranged to have them be a part of our workshops and to go to other communities. But this concept of giving the power was a really difficult one for me. And when I finally relented, I discovered that it freed me up to do more of the international work, and that they could do things I had never dreamed of doing there because they had been born in India, and many of them were Indian, so it wasn't quite so threatening to the community in terms of our status with the Indian government. And I don't think there have been many good books put out on what transition involves. And I think it's a training for people who have power, whether they're young or old or whatever, to be able to actually share that, to help people to transition in a way where some of the skills can be passed, and especially the knowledge and the history, so that we can actually build our organizations and make them much stronger. And one of the things that helps is that when you're transitioning, if the person involved that needs to be removed from power or given an opportunity to pass the power still has a viable place in the organization. And I remember saying, after we dissolved the International Advisory Council, I said to Kasia, hey, we really need an elders council. and I didn't mean an elders council in the sense of older people, but just people who had something to give that didn't have a vested interest in the organization. It took her a while. She listened, and it took her a while, but in fact, she actually formed that group. And what it has meant for many of us is that we're still involved in the Gen in a significant way, and yet in our own communities, there are other people who are actually doing the nitty-gritty everyday work and making the decisions on the local and the regional level, and that is great. That is really great.
Robert, we thought you might have danced into the fifth dimension, so we're glad that you made it back.
No, only about the seventh.
Okay. Wow, you're a seasoned transit master.
Right.
So we were thinking that maybe you could lead us in a brief facial exercise and then dive into your introduction and a little bit more about
Sure.
what else you.
Sure, I could. There are a few of you who will find this familiar, but one of the learnings around trauma healing is the importance of what happens in the upper part of the body. And so I've got actually a very simple exercise to share that I call the neurological reset. And this is, for those of you who do breathing exercises of one sort or another, this is very simple, but that's the point. So it's got three parts to it. And let me just describe it, and then we can all do it. The first part, it involves using the muscles in your face to massage the muscles in your face. So I'm doing it with my hands now, but take your hands away and just scrunch up your nose, wiggle your cheeks. And what you're doing when you do this is you're pumping blood into those facial muscles, and you're also stimulating what's called the upper parasympathetic nervous system, which is really important part of what is involved when we connect with each other. So it kind of looks funny, but, and if you laugh, Marty, that's great. You know, laughing is also really part of this. So that's the first part. We're going to do this all a little quicker when we really do it. The second part is to breathe in slowly through your nose, just easily. Breathe in through your nose. And then when you breathe out through your mouth, but more slowly than you breathe in. So you breathe in through your nose and then just release out through your mouth. You're not puffing out, you're just sort of letting it go out. So let's do that. And the three parts to it are, first you kind of wiggle your cheeks and scrunch up your nose until it tickles enough that you feel you really ought to breathe in. And then you stop wiggling your face and you breathe in and then easy out. One more time, wiggle your face, scrunch up your nose, and then breathe in through your nose, and then out through your mouth. Let's do it one last time. Wiggle your face. You know the rhythm now. When you're ready, breathe in through your nose. And then out through your mouth. Settles the nervous system. You almost always have the equipment with you. You can do it in a really you don't have to do it in as exaggerated a way as we just did. So you can actually even do it in public. So that's, Jillian, that's what you wanted me to share, right?
Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Rob. I hope you enjoyed the show, and stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue the interviews with everyone else mentioned.